Thank you, everyone, for attending this session on reporting services integration with SharePoint 2010. Slides are not showing up. Sorry about that. Well, maybe I'll ask my questions already. I want to see a show of hands as to how many of you are not aware of reporting services integration with SharePoint. Very few. Okay, good. And how many amongst you fulfill the IT role? Okay, about 25%, 30%. Okay. All right, so welcome everyone to our session on reporting services integration Denali, which is primarily the new upcoming version of reporting services with SharePoint 2010. I'm Prash, Program Manager on the Reporting Services team. And for the folks, the small percentage of folks who are not aware of reporting services integration, I will go over a brief overview, a little bit of background. Folks who are non-IT folks will definitely try to cover some of the functionality that we're providing in the Denali release, which will make you want to go back when you're in your organizations to deploy, use our Denali release. And the folks who are on the IT side, we've done a lot of work in our architecture, how we deploy, what are the topologies we support, and how we're making it easier from a configuration perspective, how are we making it better from a performance perspective. So reporting services integration with SharePoint started with version 2005 Service Pack 2. Yes, we introduced this as a service pack. And our integration was with SharePoint 2007 or WSS 3.0. So our integration is directly with the SharePoint object model. It's deep, and we work across the various editions. And in subsequent releases with 2008 R2, we made improvements and integrated also with SharePoint 2010. All the integrations allow you the entire end-to-end reporting lifecycle, which includes authoring, via BIDS, which is Development Studio, or via Report Builder, which is which was a tool all the way up to 2008 R2, and we continue to work. We'll come to that in the Denali bucket as well. In addition to that, you can view, you can manage all the reports directly inside the SharePoint UI. And to complete the circle is delivery, where you can use subscriptions. You can subscribe to a report in order for it to be delivered into either SharePoint or via email or file share. And all of this functionality we supported directly, whether it's SharePoint 2007 or 2010. And in 2010 against Foundation, Standard, or Enterprise. From a manageability perspective, we had tools. Again, these were tools that we used in the non-integrated mode, which we call as native. The native mode, there were tools for configuration. There was a tool for the admin role in SSMS, which is the SQL Server Management Studio. As well as we have a tool called rs.exe, a scripting tool, which we enabled in 2008 R2 to allow you to communicate directly with a programmability endpoint and migrate reports or deploy reports via scripting into SharePoint. Now, because of our integration, you can take advantage of the SharePoint capabilities as well, which is its collaboration, workflow. We enable support for zones, or also called as alternate access mapping, in 2008 R2, where we supported all the 5 zones, internet, intranet, extranet, default, and the custom zones with 2008 R2 and SharePoint 2010. In addition, in 2008 R2, we became the access services reporting engine inside SharePoint 2010. And we also provided a new extension where you could report against SharePoint lists. So this, in a nutshell, is a quick background and overview of as we've progressed through the various versions to Denali. So you may have seen the slide. I'll try to really quickly go through this one, where on the one hand we have Crescent, which is a cool tool for doing interactions with data, resulting in great visualizations. We have alerting, which is you can create data alerts on reports. Both these capabilities require reporting services integration with SharePoint. And the third is increased efficiency, which is about our platform for integrating with SharePoint. We have improved on the architecture so that we're more in tune with SharePoint as a shared service, which allows us to do claims, scale out with load balancing, and so on. So I'll drill down a lot more about this aspect in this particular session, all right? So how do we do this today? And I was talking to a gentleman here who was trying to do the configuration. There are different tools. So let me step you through where once SharePoint IT has installed SharePoint or plans to install a new SharePoint farm, you need to install the reporting services bits. But after that, you need to know how to use the reporting services configuration tool to create an underlying catalog database for reporting services. Not only that, but it also registered as URL because reporting services by itself was a Windows service. And it listened on a certain port and URL, so you had to configure that. Then move over to the SharePoint side and have SharePoint understand reporting services by here's the URL on which report server is listening on. Now, after that, how is the connection happening? Which is either are you going to use Windows Integrated, or are you going to use what is called the SharePoint user token? Now, a lot of folks want to do Windows Integrated as well, in which case you have to set up Kerberos. And you can see where I'm going. There are multiple steps in order to do the configuration. And so what we're trying to do in the Denali release is improve upon this, where all of this configuration is simplified, made easier for you, where it happens directly from within the SharePoint central administration. You have PowerShell, you have inbuilt scale capability, and we want you to leverage the SharePoint IT expertise that you already have gained while setting it up in the SharePoint farm, as well as setting up various shared services like Excel or Access or Power Pivot, and use that when you're setting up, configuring, or administering the reporting services integration with SharePoint. Now, before I go into the architecture, as I promised, I'd like to show you some of the functionality that we have that we want you to use our reporting services integration with SharePoint. So, quick overview. When you have reporting services integrated, then specific items like reports, which is essentially a file type with an extension .rdl, or the data source for reports is a specific file extension like RDS. interesting things happen where you have the capability to now launch or edit this particular functionality, this particular report, using our ad hoc report builder tool. New in Denali is you can create alerts on it, subscribe. All these various management capabilities are now available to you directly from within the single central SharePoint UI. And this is just a standard document library. This is not any specific document library that you have to create. So, and the other key aspect is when you click on a report, whether it's on a link here or directly in the document library, you're able to view it inside our web part. This is the report viewer web part. And you can see our visualizations, gauge chart. We also have map in R2, and so that continues on in Denali, spark lines, indicators. And so, in addition, you can have certain actions that you can create on this report when you're viewing it. We have a rich set of exports that you can do, Excel, Word, and so on. So this is, in a nutshell, our full-page viewing capability of reports. Now, I'd like to show you a dashboard list. And I created this on a SharePoint list, which comprised of my development team, which shipped a certain set of products in R2, the 2008 R2, specifically about a particular milestone called M3. Now, as you can see, all this data is not very visual. You can't infer a lot. So I have a dashboard on this. And on the one hand, I have broken it up into my immediate development team, which says, here are all the features that the team is trying to ship in this M3 milestone. And on the other hand, here's all the folks who are comprising the team of developers, testers, and so on and so forth. So obviously, the largest slice of the pie is what, as a project manager, or if you're a program manager, you want to keep in mind, close monitoring. Because at a certain point, if it slips, then you either add more resources, and you may not get those resources, and then if this is a key feature, it may have to be cut. So, so you can drill down, and when the project is in trouble, you want to look at, obviously, what the root cause is and so on. But if it's resource related, or if you have, I need to have more developers that which you need to catch up with the list of features, then you can also look on the other side and say, how many more developers I have that have some bandwidth that I can actually add to this project? So there are some folks that are available on the bench who own just one feature. Now, from a program manager or a project manager perspective, you could say, yeah, we can try to have more folks working on multiple features. But now, as a dev manager who actually manages these developers, you may have another view, which basically says, I generally want my developers to work only on one area. If there's more, I need to keep a close eye. Maybe the developer is really good, or we're stretching them thin. So, as a dev manager, I can now create a data alert, which is new in Denali. And I'm going to create a very simple data alert here, which sets the value. If the value is greater than 1, okay, then I want to get notified. Let's see. So the alert is created. By default, the schedule is once every day. What I'm actually going to do is for the sake of the demo, is I'm not going to wait for a day, obviously. So this is the alert manager. And both the alert manager and the UI, where I actually designed the alert, these are they're created in Silverlight, so they're Silverlight apps. And there's I can actually fire the alert, not fire, but trigger the alert. We're still working on the actual verb that we want to use. It needs to refresh. It's not real time, so. So it just got run, and I'm able to find that with the last run value here. It just got run. And I can actually view it. I still have my clock in Pacific time, so there's a 3-hour difference here, so that's why you'll see 10:44. So there you go. I have one super dev, James, and I think he's here, who's working on 2 areas of ownership here. So that is some of the power that you can have in terms of creating alerts on the reports. So those were operational reports where you could create full-page views, dashboards, create data alerts in them. Now let's look at the Crescent reports, they're based on the business intelligence semantic model. And these reports have a .rdlx extension when these items are deployed inside SharePoint. Obviously, you can edit this in Crescent. You can click on it and launch it in Crescent. And I have just I'm launching it here. And this is the movie sales Crescent report that you saw. Folks may have seen it in the keynote demo. My intent is to cover some of the aspects that may or may not have been covered in the keynote. Now, specifically, you may be a movie exec who wants to create, okay, what is the next movie or the genre that I want to be investing in? So here's a bubble chart that we have and has multiple measures. Here's the revenue. How much money did the movies totally make? How much of the downloads? And also the size of the bubbles themselves reflect the number of titles in each of those genres that were sold. So comedy had 70. Now if we go to drama, you can see there are 68, whereas sci-fi were 4. And you can do a play action and actually track from the year 2008 all the way through 2010 here. So now you may want to understand is like, okay, how come sci-fi suddenly, which has less number of titles, still overcome comedy? And now if I flick back, you will see it was because of Avatar. Now, you can switch to the edit mode as well of this report and add different measures as well as then save back. You can save it in the same file or a different file, a different site, a different document library as well with the save as functionality. And obviously preview. So next what I wanted to talk about is performance. So how many of you feel that, who have used reporting services integration with SharePoint, feel that there's a difference between the performance of a report rendering between SharePoint mode and native mode? Okay? And you would be right. There is a difference because the SharePoint mode reporting essentially comprises what is called the native mode engine, as well as the overhead of communicating via SharePoint for the various items that are stored inside the document library, ensuring the access check is accurate, because it is in SharePoint that the security permissions are set, and we respect those permissions, we map it accordingly, and do the appropriate access checks. So in Denali, we've definitely taken a lot of steps to actually improve on performance. Now, there are no benchmarks per se in this particular area. So what my plan is, I'll plan to demo it in front of you, and you be the judge, okay? So here's a report. Just to also set it up is that some of the smaller reports that used to take just a few seconds or even sub-seconds tended to be 2 to 3 times slower than their counterparts inside native mode. And so we looked at it closely in terms of what is the efficiencies we can do in the web part, that is on the client side, communication between our web part and the server, and then the server itself, because we did a re-architecture, as well as we optimized in making the calls based on the architecture into SharePoint. So what I have on this particular VM is also a, side by side, I have a native mode server, okay? This is, for those familiar with native mode, this is Report Manager. And I'll do a first-time rendering of the report. And then what I'm going to do is refresh. So these reports generally run, this report is, as you can see, it happens almost at par or slightly fractionally different. So that is the bar we are trying to match when it comes to the performance with Denali, okay? Now, obviously there are folks in the audience who have deployed Katmai or KJ servers. In that particular scenario, and I'll come to that a little bit more in details as well, is our Denali add-in is backwards compatible with KJ and Katmai servers. So you can deploy the Denali add-in that we have, and which is significantly still better in performance than the KJ add-in in SharePoint 2010, and use that until you decide to upgrade into the Denali server. So we talked about report in general, in SharePoint, Crescent, and alerting, as well as about performance. So let's drill down a little bit more into the architecture. Any questions until now? Can't really see. All right. So reporting services in Denali is following the shared service architecture in SharePoint. So it is a service application now, as opposed to a Windows service. And the service application is hosted inside the W3WP of IIS. As well as every service application gets its own catalog DB. So you can have multiple service applications with multiple reporting services catalogs, something you couldn't do in prior versions. You got essentially the one catalog that was integrated with the entire SharePoint farm. Next, you do not need to set up Kerberos for the Windows service anymore of reporting services, because it's a shared service that is using claims now. And Any communication between the web front end of SharePoint and the back end is based on claims. Now, there is no reporting services configuration tool that you need to use now, because all the functionality is now via, you can configure from within a single central admin pages associated with those service applications. And we'll take a look at those in the demo. That'll be a little later. PowerShell. We've created a host of PowerShell commandlets, and so you do not need to use WMI. So WMI was generally machine-based. You would connect to the machine, provide the instance name, make the appropriate configuration changes. Now, with PowerShell, if you have multiple machines that you've deployed reporting services on, in those particular cases, you just run one PowerShell commandlet, and the changes get propagated in the replicas of the service applications on the various machines. Next is in scale-out. If you had reporting services in scale-out, you had to provide the hardware or software load balancer to perform the communication based on your virtual IP, communicate over to the other physical URLs and IPs that you had for your scale-out report servers. You don't have to do that because in the Denali reporting services integration, we have an inbuilt load balancer. And we take advantage of the cross-farm SharePoint functionality, where if you have two farms that are trusting each other, they have a trust relationship set up, then you can consume reports in your dashboards from the other farms, and you don't have to keep copies of reports or data sources in both the farms. And the other aspects are, I got a question the other day, is does SharePoint backup and restore? Automatically back up everything associated with reports as well? So up until 2008 R2, the answer would be no. It doesn't back up everything. What gets backed up is you have reports, you have data sources. If these are items that are stored inside the document library, which is inside the SharePoint content databases, these will get backed up. However, stored credentials, subscriptions, shared schedules, metadata associated with reports, they are exclusively stored on the report server catalog. And so you have to back that up in addition to, along with the backup of SharePoint. So now with Denali, we're simplifying that further, where you simply include that, you select it, and in the backup and restore central admin UI, and we automatically back up along with your SharePoint backup for the farm. So let's take a look at all these things that I've been talking about. Okay. Any questions until now? Okay. Very quiet audience. So this is the SharePoint Central Administration. And once you've installed reporting services in SharePoint mode, you will see it appear in, you will want to make sure that it appears in this list, which is the managed services on the server. And ensure that it is started. Okay? Now, in this particular demo, I have web applications. So the reports that you were seeing were essentially inside this SharePoint 80 web application. Okay? And a web application has a bunch of shared services that it consumes. And there's a mapping. And here's the mapping table. It was actually talking to this particular proxy, which is associated with the reporting services web service application. So I know the mapping is in 2 different pages. Not that I like it either, but this is the mapping that we get out of the box with SharePoint. And here's the web service and the proxy. So there is a one-to-one mapping between a proxy and the shared service application. And this one is mapped to the default SharePoint 80. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be creating on the fly a new service application with its own catalog and map it to one of these web applications. So let's pick 2. It's not mapped to any reporting services service applications. So I'm going to go back here, create a new service application. So picture yourself in terms of native mode where you've basically installed side by side another report server instance. Launch config tool, create the database, go into central admin, map SharePoint to that new service instance via the URL, set up the authentication mode, whether you have Kerberos or not. Now let's take a look at what we do here. So reporting services service application is one in the list of the various service applications that you have available at your disposal to go ahead and create. So in the UI, obviously the first thing is, let's give it a name. This one maps to web app 2, so I just gave the name 2. And you have the choice to actually create a new application pool for it or not. I will use the existing one. And since this is the existing one, I don't get to change the service account. It is already in use. So now you have flexibility to change both of them if you want to have total isolation of this particular service application. The next thing is the database. Where is the report server catalog going to be created? Now, for your assistance, to make it easier, we actually pre-populate what is the instance in which SharePoint has its catalogs, its content DB, its config DB. Now, that doesn't mean you cannot change it and point it to a completely different server where you want to host the report server service application databases. One caveat you have to remember is the owners of the SharePoint database include farm admins of SharePoint. And you want to make sure in the other instance that you have, you appropriately provision those owners. Otherwise, these provisionings or these service application creations will not work in that other instance. Okay? So in this particular case, I will create it inside the same SQL database that hosts the config and content SharePoint DBs. Another thing that we've tried to make it easier than other service applications as well. So we're trying to be the easiest service application per se in your SharePoint configuration. That number one is not only do we need to be mapped, but since our data, the reports, the data sources, they reside actually inside the content DBs inside SharePoint, our service applications needs access. It needs to be provisioned so it can access that data. So if we select this particular option, we do both. We will do the mapping and We will do the provisioning for you. So at the end of this, I can, once the service application is created, then I can straight up go and render a report, which is one of my intents. Now, so this processing is essentially creating all the various artifacts behind the scenes, which includes the database and so on and so forth. It does take a little bit of time, but it's a lot less than creating the config tool, going back into the central admin, and doing all the various configurations in order to have a running reporting services integration with SharePoint. Okay. So while this is going on, I want to also, actually came back. Oh, happened pretty fast. So it's already created. So it's done. And so you could actually, I'll leave the screen open for a second, but so what I'm going to do is, this is Web App 2, and I'll talk about the mapping. But I'll go ahead and click on the dashboard here. And so just keep in mind this particular URL, okay? It's on port 8080 of this particular machine. And what I want to do is, I want to show that the mapping has already happened. And magically you'll see, we've done the mapping for you. You don't have to go to the separate UI to do the additional mapping and so on. So one step, one page, we do this for you. So let's go back to this page, and the dashboard is rendered. This is the dashboard we saw before. So within like 3 or 4 minutes, I have, quote unquote, an instance running with reporting services integrated with SharePoint. So I wanted to talk next about PowerShell. Yes. Yes, go ahead. So the question is, are we going to release a service pack that is going to have the shared service infrastructure and the SharePoint and the central admin functionality that I'm showing? Good question. The answer is no. This is specific to Denali. This is the architecture work we did in Denali. There's a lot that the re-architecting entailed. It can be just taken as a service pack and added into Cat9 or KJ. Yes. So once you install Denali, you go to the page, you'll see the reporting, exactly, you'll see the reporting services inside managed services on server. Then you can create the service application with a drop-down and so on. Absolutely. Yes. I can't really see because of lights, but yeah. Who was that? Yeah. Oh, it's here. All right, go ahead. So the question I believe that I could hear was, do you have to enable reporting services configuration manager? So the reporting services configuration manager is not needed. It's not supported against Denali because the key thing underlying with the configuration manager is WMI. You don't need WMI anymore. We have PowerShell, and we have, which I'm going to talk next, and everything that you can do is all directly within the same one central admin UI. Okay, so the question is about, do you have to select a reporting services option when you are actually installing with SQL Server? So, yes, and I will go into those scenarios a little later. I have specific slides that deal with the actual deployment. Hold your question till there, and I will definitely address that. Okay, so am I using one SSRS server or multiple SSRS servers? So from a server perspective, every service application is its own report server. Every service application you're creating gets its own catalog, gets its own runtime, gets its own background processing, and it's all hosted within the W3WP of IIS. So when you're creating separate service applications in turn, that's why I keep the analogy. You would have to have installed another instance, get its own database, and somehow hook it onto SharePoint. So these are, yes? So, correct. So today, you cannot install separate instances of report servers going to separate catalogs and integrate it into the same SharePoint farm. You cannot do that. It's not supported. You can have that one instance scaled out, talking to the one catalog, but it's still at the back, still remains the one catalog that gets mapped to the entire SharePoint farm. Okay? So there are no plans to do that in KJ or Katmai. So this is a new architecture in Denali that will allow you that ability via the service application architecture. Okay? Sorry about that, though. I guess it's a little bit of my glasses and the lights, but I can't make out. So just holler, okay? So PowerShell, what I wanted to cover is what do we give you in terms of the PowerShell capabilities. And the first thing I want to get to you is use the SPRS prefix. With that, you'll be able to get the list of all our PowerShell commandlets. I'll give you a very brief 101 on these PowerShell commandlets. So the first two, the gentleman asked me about the setup, and are you going to see it after installing it in SharePoint? These are the two key PowerShell commandlets we run, which registers our bits on the machine with SharePoint. And once we do that, then it appears inside the managed services on the server page. And that essentially is an indicator that now you can go and create new service applications and do the appropriate mapping to your web applications. Okay? The next thing I talked about is, obviously I was talking about service applications. And these set of commands essentially are what we use when we are creating new service applications, editing, managing. And the rest of them are reporting services specific artifacts. Encryption key is primarily about, we store sensitive information, stored credentials, we store connection string. These are all need to be encrypted. So we use our own encryption key. And just like in WMI, we give you PowerShell commandlets to manage these keys. Next is the database. This is a key requirement, which is essentially a catalog. And you can create new, edit, change, mount, dismount, use it, and also backup and restore. And we'll get to that a little later. And last is extensions. So now, with the PowerShell command list, especially when you have a multi-machine scenario where you have service applications that are replicated on different servers, you don't want to use a cut-paste, which you would generally do. If you want to edit, you want to add, you want to cut-paste the config files in every machine. Well, you don't have to do that anymore. You run a PowerShell commandlet that ensures all the service application replicas get accordingly updated with the edits or the new data extension. So I can run a couple of these quick, and so this is the new service application I created. This is the previous one. And these are the associated service application proxies that allow me to communicate with from the web application to my service application. So about the extensions. You need to pass a parameter to it which tells which service application am I talking about, because every service application gets its own set of extensions that you can configure and customize. So here's a list, and you can drill down this list. You can pass parameters and expand on each and individual ones, but there's a lot of extensions that we support, and these generally used to be in the config file, and you had to manually hand edit these config files, which could be error prone, especially if you have multiple machines out there. So we're trying to make it easier for you using our PowerShell commandlets. So what I want to do next is I want to actually show you about 10 or 12 lines of code which actually creates on the fly a new quote-unquote report server. In this case, it is a service application, has the inbuilt proxy and the mapping between a web application and the reporting service application. So what this is going to try to do is what we did in the UI. And as you can see, it's a concise 10 or 12 lines of code. And for the most part, reporting services specific things are here, where we're creating a new service application. So the key things to provide is the application pool, the name of the service app, and the database. So in this case, there is an existing app pool, so I don't have to give the service account for the app pool. But this, in essence, is the command to give you the service application, which is here. Now, I have all the code in the appendix, so you don't have to worry about the code itself. Next is the proxy. And this particular proxy is trying to be hooked to this service application that we just created above. And step number 3 and 4 are standard SharePoint set of commands. So only you'll notice these two are the SPRS specific commands. The rest of them are, let me group them together in this proxy group. And finally, this is the mapping. The mapping between the web application to service application requires the proxy group. And that's the only reason why I have most of the other 60% of the code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let it run. And with the name 3, hopefully it's evident that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to map this to the web application number 3, which also did not have any underlying reporting services service application. Okay? So this is still running. So in that particular So while it is still doing this, I want to draw your attention to some of the click OK here. Yes. So the question is, when you do the mapping assignment, does it automatically turn on the features in the site collection? The answer to that is, from a content type perspective, it will be no. You would have to go into the content type and actually add the content types. But the feature by itself should be activated via the add-in. And I will get to that deployment a little later in the slides, and I will show you how that works. Okay? So what I want to draw your attention to is monitoring. And what we've done is we've added end-to-end ULS logging. So currently, and you can actually filter, if you're using ULS Viewer or any of the viewers out there, filter based on the SQL Server Reporting Services category. Now, key point to note is all the server traces are prefixed with the report server prefix, so you can filter based on that as well. And now, for the most part, in SharePoint, you will end up getting a correlation ID. You get an error, you get a correlation ID. In R2, you probably take the correlation ID, look at the ULS log, and then see what timestamp it actually now goes into report server. And then take the timestamp and find out the report server error log. You don't have to piece together the story anymore. You can get the entire thing directly inside the SharePoint ULS log. Now, from a back compat perspective, if you have tools dealing with reporting services error logs, we provide those as well. So you can choose to use the report server error logs still as well. Backup and restore is another capability that I want to draw your attention to. Is when you're doing a backup and restore with SharePoint, now you'll automatically back up all our underlying DBs. And you want to go into the shared service application category. And yes, it does look, this UI is not reporting services specific, so there are some additional spaces that are coming up here. But so here's the reporting services databases that get backed up. So you'll notice 3 of them. One is the RS catalog, the other is the temp DB, and the third one is specific for alerting. So there's 3 DBs that actually comprise when I mentioned the RS catalog. All of them get backed up now when you enable the backup from SharePoint. Okay. So let's take a look at the PowerShell. Maybe it has, yep, it has completed. So I have a third web application here, which is web app 3. Listening on port, oh, no, that's not the one. Actually, this is the one. Yeah, so it's listening on port 8008. And let's take a look at its mapping. Oops. It actually brought up the site. Just give me a second. Back. So it has done a custom mapping. You can see the group. We created the group here. And it has done our mapping with the proxy. And I had deployed some reports. So you can click on it, and it automatically starts up the rendering of the report, just like we did in the previous web app. So in a matter of minutes, you now have an up and running report server service application to receive rendering requests from the report. One quick thing that I wanted to mention here is we have various capabilities to actually manage our service application as well. Now, folks who are using the reporting services configuration tool will be aware that some of the key management, where we manage the encryption key, execution account, and email, these are all now inside Central Admin. And these are from SSMS, where we had the system properties for the report. They can all be now set inside Central Admin. And jobs, which are jobs created for long-running subscriptions. You can list and cancel. All of that functionality is now put in one Central Admin. One interesting point here is provisioning of subscriptions. So in the database instance that you created reporting services, if you want to have the subscription and alerting functionality, you need to turn on SQL Server Agent. And we're making it easier for you via this page. Now, if your IT and DBA roles are truly separated, where you have to give a script, we have the ability to give you a script and say, hand it over to your DBA, let him run it, and you can have the appropriate provisioning. Now, the key need is not only the agent is running, but the provisioning aspect where you need to have read and execute permissions for the report server service account to actually to use that particular SQL agent functionality. All right, and if you have the DBA credentials, then we allow you to provide that and get yourself provision. Okay. So we looked at some of the service application functionalities. Now let's drill down a little bit into how we actually achieve these and how do you deploy these. So I'll go through a clean install scenario and go through how you would actually install this in the web front end. So we have a reporting services add-in that you would install in the web front end, puts all the bits in the right places. It includes Crescent and alerting. And at the end of the install, you have a working functionality of the VOWeb part. You have the Crescent and alerting Silverlight components. Now, folks who have used the 2008 R2 version will be familiar with this configuration as local mode. What local mode is essentially is you have out of the box access reports and SharePoint list reports available to you. So, having said that, you don't get Crescent or alerting as yet. You need to actually install the shared service. Now, if you're installing both the web front end and the app server on the same machine, then in SQL Server Denali setup, you will have two checkboxes that you have when you're actually selecting the features. And you can install both of them at the same time. Whether it's in the UI or via command line, you can install both of them at the same time, so it reduces the number of steps for you to actually deploy the bits. Okay? So, setup installs, and it registers, which is it runs those two PowerShell commandlets. And then it's done. Now, IT has full capability, the SharePoint IT or farm admins have full capabilities to start creating service applications and mapping them to the web applications, which is what we saw. And you get your database, you get the service application, and each service application has the WCF endpoints to talk via claims over the proxy. It has both the alerting and the reporting services runtimes. Background processing for subscriptions, data management for any synchronization between SharePoint and our service application DB. So so now you can go and start creating all these service applications. How does upgrade look like? I had a gentleman here who wanted to understand how do we upgrade. So in Denali, we support both in-place upgrade, which is, I would say, as well as migration. Now, in-place upgrade tends to be the more complicated scenario because the intent is whatever you had working before, you want to get it working afterwards as well. So, concept is similar to the install in terms of actual deployments. The Denali add-in will do an in-place upgrade of your KJ add-in inside SharePoint 2010. And you will get the crescent bits and learning bits as well. Now, yes, go ahead. Is there a question?
For the add-in, do you have to install all of your web front-end?
Yes. So the question is, do you have to install all the add-in on your web, all your web front ends? And the answer is yes. You have to install the add-in on all the web front ends. And when you install it, that's when it actually activates the features in the site collections. And in this particular scenario, it is working against the Catman KJ servers. So it supports back compat with KJ and Catman server. Now, since it's not a Denali server, you will not have the crescent and alerting functionality working until you install the Denali shared service, which also supports in-place upgrade. And it does a few more steps than a clean install, essentially. It will register it, and then it will actually create a default service application. And that service application essentially will have the same name as the report server instance. It'll be like report server underscore, say, Power Pivot or instance 1. That'll be the name of your service application. And it upgrades your catalog to now be a Denali catalog, and behind the scenes creates the appropriate DBs to constitute now a service application catalog. Okay? The question is, do you have to upgrade the DB engine itself? So the reporting services catalog by itself can be used in 2005 SQL Server database or higher. Okay, so it doesn't support 2000, 2005 or higher. So you can have the database there, and based on that, provide the SQL instance name when you're creating the service application. Okay. And it also does the mapping for you. In this particular case, it maps you against all the web applications in the farm, which is how you had the previous KJ or Catman report server, where it was available for the entire farm. And then the upgrade completes. So that is essentially how we support in-place upgrade. Similarly, you can have a migrate scenario with side-by-side. So that also is supported. So another scenario is the way I look at it is behind the scenes of the Web App 2 demo that I did is what actually happened when I did all the stuff in the UI. So number one, we had created a SharePoint web application, Web App 2, that had a replica of the report server add-in functionality running with the crescent and the VO web part where you can see the dashboards and so on. And this particular web application obviously needed a backend shared service. Now, when we went in the UI and created it, that is when you got a new database, you got a new host, and the mapping. And so that essentially enables, now I have a mapping one-to-one between my web application and service application, each having their own catalog databases. Okay? Scale out. So in case of the multi-machine scale out. So SharePoint allows you, obviously, add another machine to the farm. You basically point it to the config DB and it joins the farm. At this particular point, you don't have reporting service on the machine, so there is no service application running. So you will have to install the report server shared service, and it'll register the instance, but that's about it. Once it registers the instance, it has a replica of the other service application, and it simply runs as service application 1 on the server, on server 2. And now our load balancer kicks in. So the first connection request would go to server 1, the next one to server 2. Currently, it is a simple round-robin load balancer that we provide, and that's what you get out of the box. Okay? Any question? Yeah. Would you need a license for the second install? The answer would be yes. We're figuring out what the exact licensing will be for Denali as yet. But I'll give you an analogy for the previous versions. If you had scale out, you had to buy the enterprise license. And so a similar kind of licensing will be applicable in this case. Okay? Another thing folks have been asking me about is claims and using a Windows integrated data source to go to the back end. So this is a scenario where we have a Windows user logging into SharePoint, the interactive user, and they're going to use their own credentials to connect to SQL Server. Now, SQL Server doesn't support claims. So what really happens? And I have a data flow that I would like to show you, where I click on the Northwind report that we've been seeing. This particular report, obviously the proxy is going to make the appropriate access checks to make sure the user 1 has access to the Northwood report, and then flows the user's claims over the request to WCF endpoint on the other side. And if the user has access, we create the context. We have an on-demand sync, which I've been talking about, and this essentially ensures that do we have the latest version of our report in our own catalog. Now, if we don't, we can get it over from SharePoint. And this RDL file is handed over to a processing and rendering engine, and this rendering engine essentially now wants the data. In order to get the data, there is a new service that SharePoint uses in the claims environment. It's called the Claims to Windows Token Conversion Service. It runs locally in the box. It needs to be configured along with the configuration of the SharePoint farm. This particular service gives us the Windows identity that we use. When I say we, it is actually the data extension. When the data extension makes the open connection call to the backend database, that is the identity it uses to actually make the connection. And once we get the data, that information is provided back to the user. Yeah. Is that why you don't need Kerberos anymore? Well, the answer to the question is, the reason why we don't need Kerberos is because our application isn't a Windows service by itself. It is a service application. Now, to configure C2WTS, which is part of the SharePoint farm, you will need to set up Kerberos for that particular process. Okay? Now, you will need to do that for any other shared service as well if it wants to get data outside the farm. If you have Excel, you will have to configure C2WTS if it needs to go outside to get data. Okay? So it is standard for the farm itself in order to configure that particular service. Okay? Crescent. I want to do a quick end-to-end about Crescent data flow as well. Because we've definitely been asked is like, what are the underlying pieces that Crescent uses in order to actually show the great visualizations and the interactivity? So on the one hand, it needs the added because that is what it primarily talks to. Next, it actually talks to the service application, which we have been talking about. And then at the back, the actual data source that has the model, the BISM model, is either Power Pivot or the analysis services service, okay? Which is not dependent on SharePoint. So either one of them can be used with Crescent. And when these pieces are put together, installed, Power Pivot and Analysis Service for Denali also ship with the SQL Server setup, by the way. And Crescent uses URL access, normal URL access or SOAP commands to our add-in, which forwards the request via claims to our service application. And then the service application uses the new BISM data extension, the Business Intelligence Semantic Model data extension, to make the calls, basically DAX queries, to the Power Pivot backend service. Okay? And that's when you get the data showing up inside the Crescent reports. So there's an additional requirement on either the Power Pivot shared service or the analysis service that you need to get Crescent end-to-end. Okay? Any questions? Okay. Integrated experience, a couple of two things that I wanted to convey. We already talked about performance. Two other things is when you want to browse via report server. So there is no report server HTTP link anymore. It is, you can browse though, because there's no Windows service. There's no HTTP server, there's no Windows service. It essentially is browsable via the proxy. And the last two things I can quickly show is about the new Excel and Word renderer formats. Okay? So, quick thing is the browse experience. For those of you who used to browse with the report server, will notice this, the UI is exactly almost the same. And it's exactly the same, actually. And the key thing to note is VTI bin. This is how you access the proxy, the report server proxy in that site. Okay? And you can do the normal browsing that you're used to with report server. Okay? One thing I do want to show is the new Excel renderers, which does not have the 65K limitation. And a couple of URL access commands you can actually add is so the new format value is Excel Open XML. And one additional parameter you want to tag is and what this will do is this will allow you to now capture this report in Excel, the new Excel format. And the same command will apply to Word, where you will want to, oh, there you go. You can save it. And it is saving it in the new XLSX format, as you can see here. So the Word renderer has the same concept where instead of Excel, you would use Word. Okay? So since we're running out of time, we just have 1 minute left. This was the demo, and hopefully you have now a good overview of what exactly are we offering you inside the SharePoint UI, okay? The end-to-end user experiences. We've gone through the architecture and the various deployments that you can do, install, upgrade. What is the IT experience enhancement that you're going to get in Denali? We'd like you to sign up at our BI booth, so you can get you can get an email notification of our Denali CDP, so you can try it out, check out our performance, check out the new Denali Crescent alerting as well as SharePoint experience, and give us feedback. Okay? I do have a bunch in the appendix in terms of code. I didn't go through the standard marketing slides, but absolutely take a look at the code as well that I presented. And send us your evals. Thank you. Any questions?